The air in the Blair Valley settlement of West Virginia, late in the summer of 1878, did not move. It hung thick and oppressive, smelling of damp pine needles and the faint, sweet decay of distant, uncontrolled nature. The valley was a hollow cradle cupped in the vast, unforgiving spine of the Appalachian Mountains, a place where the sun was a luxury and the shadow of the mountains was a permanent resident. Here, life was measured not by clock time, but by the relentless rhythm of seasons, the rise and fall of the creek, and the somber toll of the First Baptist Chapel's bell. It was a community bound tight by necessity, faith, and the crushing isolation that defined their existence. The Alderson family farm lay furthest up the crooked trail, a cluster of worn timber buildings that seemed to lean into the hillside for support. Elias Alderson, the patriarch, was not a kind man, but he was a respected one. A successful timber worker known for his iron will and unyielding adherence to Scripture. His wife, Martha, was a spectral figure, her eyes permanently shadowed by what the community quietly called mountain melancholy. They had 3 children, Tobias, the eldest son, who had the uncharacteristic softness of his mother. Amelia, the spirited middle daughter, now married and living miles away, and Caleb, the youngest, a boy whose quiet intelligence was mistaken for timidity. The tragedy began with a profound, terrifying silence. It was mid-August. The oppressive heat had finally broken with a series of torrential thunderstorms that turned the muddy trails into deep, slow-moving rivulets of reddish-brown water. Tobias, a man of 23 with shoulders already stooped from heavy labor, returned to the main cabin at dusk after a long day hauling lumber. The usual signs of life were absent. The familiar, sharp smell of Martha's stew was missing. There was no rhythmic clatter of the dishes being prepared, no sound of his father's heavy-booted step, and no faint hum of Caleb working on his small, self-made mechanical contraptions in the back room. The silence was not peaceful. It was a physical presence, heavy and chilling. Tobias dropped his axe with a dull thud on the porch. Mother, father, Caleb. His voice, a low baritone, sounded unnaturally loud and reedy in the stillness. He stepped inside. The kerosene lamp, usually lit by this hour, stood unlit on the worn wooden table. A half-eaten loaf of bread, sliced unevenly, sat beside a chipped ceramic bowl, but no one was at the table. The cabin, normally bustling with the small, irritating noises of a family living too close, was eerily immaculate. Tobias's heart began to thud, not from fear yet, but from a sudden, cold wave of disorientation. Elias Alderson did not tolerate disorder. He did not tolerate unanswered calls. He walked to the back room, a narrow space that served as his parents' bedroom. The heavy oak door stood ajar. He pushed it open slowly. The room was empty. The bed covers were turned down neatly, as if for an approaching rest, but the room lacked the scent of occupation. Tobias moved quickly to Caleb's small annex, a converted lean-to attached to the kitchen. Caleb's workbench was empty. His tools, a collection of crude gears and springs he had salvaged, were tidily lined up. Caleb would never leave his tools unattended. A single, small detail caught Tobias's eye on the kitchen counter. A damp rag, crumpled beside the wash basin. It was too small to be his mother's, too neatly folded, even when crumpled, to be his father's. It was the color of homespun linen, familiar but out of place. He checked the barn, empty, save for the nervous stamping of their solitary mule, Bess. He checked the outhouse, the smokehouse. Nothing. Dusk deepened into twilight. The valley was losing its shape, dissolving into deep, purple shadows that crept out of the surrounding woods. Tobias, now truly cold, grabbed the nearest lantern, lit the wick, and rushed back to the main cabin, his boots pounding on the wet dirt. He rushed to the family Bible, a massive leather-bound volume that sat on a dedicated shelf, its pages brittle with age and frequent handling. Elias used it daily. Tobias pulled it down, his hands slick with sweat. It fell open not to a psalm or a proverb, but to a page that had been meticulously dog-eared. There, tucked between the pages of Genesis, was a single thick piece of unbleached parchment, folded once. Tobias laid the Bible on the table and unfolded the parchment. His hand shook so badly the light of the lantern seemed to tremble on the surface of the paper. The handwriting was his mother's, Martha's, but it was not her usual, elegant cursive. It was blocky, almost frantic. The ink bled slightly as if the pen had been pressed too hard, or perhaps written with tears. There was only one line. "It is safer now beneath the pines. Tell no one we are gone." Safer? Safer than what? Safer than their own home? The note was an abyss. It explained nothing and implied a terror so profound it drove a deeply religious family to abandon everything they knew and prized. Elias Alderson would never leave his home, his land, or his community without a final defiant word, least of all for fear. And Martha would never have composed such a cryptic, unsettling message. Tobias ran out the door, the lantern swinging wildly, casting chaotic shadows across the valley floor. He sprinted down the muddied path toward the nearest cabin, the home of Deacon Silas Finch, the pillar of the chapel. He needed help, but more than that, he needed the reassurance that this was a misunderstanding, a terrible, ill-judged family trip, not the beginning of a relentless, unfolding nightmare. He burst onto Deacon Finch's porch, mud splattering on the polished wood. "Deacon! Deacon Finch! They're gone. My family, they've vanished." Silas Finch, a man whose face was a map of Appalachian hardship, opened the door, a candle held high. He listened patiently, his face unreadable, as Tobias stumbled through the account of the silence, the empty rooms, and the cryptic note. When Tobias finally held out the parchment, Finch did not take it. He simply fixed Tobias with a cold, unsettling stare. "Tobias," the deacon said, his voice a low, gravelly monotone, "there's been talk. Talk that your father, Elias, he wasn't well. Not for some time." "What talk? My father was strong, a man of God," Tobias protested, his voice cracking. "Madness has many faces in these mountains, son. Sometimes it wears the face of absolute faith. Sometimes it makes people do things they regret. For the sake of the valley and the reputation of the church, we must be discreet. We must believe that your family, Elias, Martha, and Caleb, have simply chosen to seek salvation in solitude. No one needs to know they vanished. They departed by choice." The implication was clear. The church, the core of their community, was not interested in searching. It was interested in control and erasure. They saw not a mystery to be solved, but a scandal to be buried, and Tobias was left standing alone on a porch, holding a piece of paper that felt less like a note and more like a tombstone. The terrifying stillness of the empty farm was now matched by the chilling indifference of the man of God, and Tobias realized the true horror had only just begun. The mountains held the secret, and the community was determined to keep it hidden. This mystery is only beginning to unfold, and the truth is buried deep beneath the mountains. To make sure you don't miss a single terrifying chapter of this story, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel right now. Tobias did not sleep that night. He spent the hours before dawn pacing the small confines of the Alderson cabin, the air thick with the phantom sense of his missing family. Deacon Finch's chilling directive to frame the vanishing as a voluntary departure had cemented a terrible new reality. The threat wasn't just the mountains, it was the community itself. The church, the supposed moral backbone of Blair Valley, was actively complicit in concealing the truth. He reread Martha's note a dozen times, smoothing the wrinkled parchment until the ink began to feel warm under his thumb. "It is safer now beneath the pines. Tell no one we are gone." The phrase haunted him. Beneath the pines. It was vague, yet specific, a reference to the dense forestation that began just beyond their small cleared farmstead. It sounded less like a geographical direction and more like a final resting place. The mention of the pines immediately called to mind the old logging trail, a disused path that snaked up the eastern ridge. It was lined with some of the valley's oldest and thickest pines, a place Elias had forbidden the children to go, claiming the path was unstable and cursed by old mining ghosts, a rare half-hearted concession to folklore from the staunchly religious man. Before the sun was a visible disk, merely a graying smudge on the horizon, Tobias strapped on his leather boots, slipped a hunting knife into his belt, and took the axe he'd dropped the day before. He bypassed the main road. The community was already stirring, and he knew eyes would be watching. Finch's silence was a collective burden. He cut through the swampy back 40, climbing until the Alderson farm looked like a child's discarded toy set below. The old logging trail was barely visible, choked with ferns and fallen limbs. The air here was noticeably colder, the dense pine canopy holding the night's chill. As he walked, Tobias forced himself to analyze the situation with the logic his father had always demanded. Motive. Why would they leave? Financial ruin. Impossible. Elias was doing well. The last timber contract had paid handsomely. A threat. If so, from whom? They had no enemies outside the usual petty squabbles over boundary lines. Elias's supposed madness? This was the deacon's insidious suggestion. But if Elias had simply lost his mind and dragged them away, why the cryptic, almost pleading note from Martha? And why the emphasis on safer now? Martha was trying to communicate a danger they were escaping, not one they were causing. 2 hours of grueling silent ascent brought him to a plateau. The pines here were colossal ancient pillars of the forest. He stopped, listening not for voices, but for anything unnatural. A broken branch, the smell of wood smoke, a recent fire pit. He found the first sign near a cluster of large, oddly shaped boulders that had tumbled down the slope centuries ago. It was not a footprint or a broken twig, but something far more intimate. A small silver locket half buried in the damp soil. Tobias's breath hitched. He knew it instantly. It belonged to Caleb, his shy, inventive younger brother. Caleb had traded 3 days' worth of chores to the blacksmith's son for it. It was cheap, unremarkable, but Caleb had treasured it because it held a tiny pressed 4-leaf clover he'd once found, his only piece of what he called non-mechanical luck. Tobias scraped the dirt away with his knife. The locket was closed, but the delicate silver chain had been cleanly snapped, not pulled apart. It suggested a sudden violent movement or perhaps a deliberate severing. He pocketed the locket, his resolve hardening into cold steel. His family had not simply departed. They had been running or perhaps taken. The trail led further, becoming steeper and more treacherous. Then he found the second, more disturbing clue. Tucked beneath the roots of a massive pine, shielded from the elements, was a small, leather-bound book. It was Elias's personal journal, a record he kept of timber sales, sermons, and private reflections. Tobias sat on a mossy log, his heart hammering against his ribs, and opened the book. The last entry was dated 2 days before their disappearance. It detailed a normal day of work and a harsh, self-critical prayer about his failings as a father. But the page immediately following the last written entry was torn out, cleanly, deliberately removed. Tobias ran his fingers over the jagged tear in the spine. Why would Elias, or anyone who took the journal, remove just one page? It wasn't a section, it was a single leaf, ripped out to hide a single specific piece of information. As he flipped backward through the journal, he began to notice a pattern that had been hidden by Elias's severe, economical handwriting. Scattered among the entries about finances and weather were small, almost illegible symbols. They looked like nothing Tobias had ever seen, not letters, not numerals, but simple, repetitive shapes. A circle with 3 parallel lines through it, an interlocking triangle, a crescent moon with a dot underneath. They appeared sporadically, sometimes just once a month, sometimes twice in a week. They looked like the obsessive scribbles of a mind under immense, unacknowledged strain. The realization struck him with the force of a physical blow. The community's suspicion of Elias's madness wasn't baseless, it was misdirected. His father hadn't been acting erratic, he had been documenting something, a private, terrifying obsession that he couldn't share. Tobias turned back to the torn page. The removed entry must have contained the key, the nature of the obsession, the reason for the symbols, or perhaps the specific danger that prompted Martha's note. He descended the trail, the journal and locket heavy in his pockets, the knowledge of his isolation weighing on him even more. The sun was fully up now, casting long, sharp rays across the valley, but the shadows in Tobias's mind were deeper than ever. He knew he couldn't trust the deacon. He couldn't trust the church. His search had to be entirely clandestine. Back at the farm, he hid the journal under a loose floorboard in the empty kitchen. The silence of the cabin was now unbearable, a void filled with questions. He was suddenly aware of the need for an ally, someone outside the narrow judgmental confines of the valley. There was only one person, Amelia, his sister. She lived 3 ridgelines over, married to a railroad worker, far enough away to be outside Deacon Finch's immediate influence. Tobias spent the rest of the day performing the necessary chores, his face a mask of sorrowful acceptance for the few neighbors who dared to approach, offering meaningless platitudes about God's will. He confirmed to them what Finch wanted. The Aldersons had chosen to seek a quieter, more isolated life of prayer. He repeated the lie until the bitter taste of it felt permanent in his mouth. He watched the sun set, transforming the distant peaks into silhouettes of black velvet. That night, under the cold, indifferent stars of the Appalachian sky, Tobias packed a small satchel. He wasn't just searching the woods anymore. He was escaping the lie of the valley to seek the only truth he could trust, the desperate, frightened eyes of his sister. He had to get to Amelia. He had to show her the cryptic note, the snapped locket, and the torn journal. He had to convince her that their father hadn't gone mad. He had been fearing something. The first decisive step in his solitary investigation had been taken, but the deeper Tobias delved into the mystery, the more unsettling the questions became. Who had removed the page? And what chilling secret had Elias Alderson been obsessively recording in the final panicked days before he disappeared beneath the pines? The journey to Amelia's settlement, a dusty railroad stop called Iron Creek, was a grueling 2-day trek. Tobias moved with a grim, relentless urgency, using old hunting paths and crossing the fast-flowing tributaries of the New River. The landscape, usually a comforting backdrop of familiar hardship, now felt hostile, a vast, indifferent repository of secrets. Each step was shadowed by the fear that he was already too late and by the heavy burden of the lie he was forced to maintain. He was now a master of deception, nodding solemnly when a farmer offered him condolences on his family's devout departure. The silence of the valley's complicity was a suffocating pressure, teaching him that the church's authority was less about salvation and more about maintaining order at any cost. He arrived at Iron Creek exhausted and coated in dust. The settlement was a raw, chaotic contrast to Blair Valley's stillness. The air vibrated with the metallic clang of hammers, the hiss of steam engines, and the rough shouts of laborers. Amelia's home was a small, hastily built cabin near the tracks, a jarring change from the solid timber of the Alderson farm. He found her hanging laundry, her face flushed from the heat and labor. At 21, Amelia had her mother's delicate features, but her spirit was fire, a trait Elias had spent years trying and failing to extinguish. "Tobias," she cried, dropping a wet shirt. Her initial joy dissolved immediately as she took in his gaunt face and the deep exhaustion in his eyes. "What is it? Did Papa send you? Is Mother well?" Tobias walked past her, straight into the small, clean cabin. He didn't speak until she had shut the door, cutting off the noise of the railroad. "They're gone, Amelia," he stated, his voice flat. "All of them. Father, Mother, and Caleb." He then recounted the events with brutal brevity. The silent cabin, Deacon Finch's chilling silence, and the demand that he lie to protect the church's reputation. He produced the 3 pieces of evidence: Martha's cryptic note, Caleb's snapped locket, and Elias's torn journal. Amelia collapsed onto a stool, her hands covering her mouth, tears streaming down her face. Gone? But why? Papa wouldn't. He wouldn't abandon the land. It was his life. He didn't abandon it. Tobias insisted, laying the evidence on the small table. He fled it. Martha's note says they sought safety. And look at this. He pushed the journal toward her, pointing to the strange, repetitive symbols scattered throughout the pages. Do you recognize any of this? Did Father ever talk about anything unusual? Anything that troubled him deeply? Amelia wiped her eyes, forcing herself to look. She studied the symbols, the circle and lines, the interlocking triangles. Her brow furrowed in desperate concentration. No, she whispered, shaking her head. He talked only of God and of the damned. He was a hard man, Tobias, but he was logical. He hated superstition. He'd never tolerate anything like this. She stopped, her eyes fixed on the blank space where the last entry had been ripped out. Who tore this out? If Father wrote it, why would he destroy it? I don't know, Tobias admitted, the frustration a bitter metallic taste. But the tearing is too neat. It was done deliberately to hide whatever was written there. And why leave the book behind, unless it was meant as a clue or a distraction? Amelia picked up the locket, tracing the jagged break in the chain. Caleb would never lose this. He cherished it. This wasn't lost. It was dropped while running. She looked up, her blue eyes now blazing with a fierce, cold resolve that reminded Tobias of their father, at his most unyielding. The deacon is lying. The valley is hiding something. It's worse than lying, Amelia. They're trying to erase it. They want the tragedy to be a simple, shameful tale of a man's lapse into madness, rather than a mystery about a family running from a threat. Amelia stood up, pacing the small room. This obsession of Father's, these symbols, it started recently, didn't it? I remember when I visited last fall. He was withdrawn. He kept making these trips alone, deep into the woods, claiming he was scouting new timber, but he'd come back with dirt on his hands and eyes that looked like he'd seen a ghost. He hated the supernatural, Tobias reiterated, so whatever he saw, whatever he was documenting, it had to be real, a real threat, something human. Amelia's husband, Silas Vance, a thick-set man with powerful arms and a quiet demeanor, came in then, filling the doorway. He stopped short, sensing the heavy tension. Amelia quickly and carefully explained the situation, omitting only the deacon's direct involvement in the cover-up. She presented it as a simple, baffling disappearance. Silas listened, his expression growing serious. He had no love for Elias, who had always viewed Silas as beneath his daughter, but the reality of a missing family in the mountains was grim. They must have gone north, toward the river, Silas speculated, stepping into the role of a practical man. The trails are tough, but they'd eventually reach the main highway, maybe catch a coach to a bigger town. Elias might have been seeking medical help, or simply a fresh start. No, Tobias cut in, showing him the note. Beneath the pines, not towards the river. And the note is a warning, not a goodbye. They're still in the mountains, Silas. I believe the answer is in that journal, or where that journal leads. Silas frowned, looking at the symbols. These marks, they look like something a surveyor would use, or a miner. There are old, abandoned coal prospect shafts all through those pines, deeper than anyone cares to admit. Maybe Elias found something he shouldn't have. The mention of the coal shafts struck a chord. The region's history was steeped in dangerous, often illegal prospecting. Elias hated the mining companies, calling them vultures on God's land. But the possibility that his obsession centered on a physical discovery, something valuable or perhaps something dangerous, was compelling. I need to know what that missing page said, Tobias declared. I need to know who tore it out and what Elias was doing in those woods. I need to go back, but I can't be seen searching openly. The deacon will rally the community against me. Amelia stood beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. I'll help, Tobias. I'll take a message to our cousin Eliza in the nearby town of Hinton. She knows people, and she's not beholden to the Blair Valley Church. She can help us investigate the symbols, and I'll find a way to get back to the valley without suspicion. You're too exposed here, Silas warned, looking at the tracks outside. The moment the search for them goes public, everyone will be scrutinized. That's why we have to control the narrative, Tobias said, the cold resolve back in his eyes. I will go back to Blair Valley and play the part of the grieving son who has accepted his fate. I will watch the deacon. And while I watch the church, you, Amelia and Silas, you look into the symbols, the old prospect shafts, and the history of that logging trail. The family tragedy they're trying to erase must be rooted in something physical and real. The burden of proof now lay not on the missing, but on the two remaining siblings who had to unravel a conspiracy of silence perpetuated by their entire community. Tobias left Iron Creek before midnight, the weight of his sister's shared fear and Silas's quiet support replacing the crushing loneliness of the night before. He was going back into the belly of the beast. He was going to find out what his father feared, and who had profited from his family's terrifying silence. Back in Blair Valley, Tobias played his part perfectly. He attended the Sunday service, a somber, silent figure dressed in black. Deacon Finch delivered a sermon thinly veiled as a eulogy, praising Elias Alderson for his commitment to solitude and prayer, a testament to a man who knew when to retreat from the world. Tobias endured the hypocritical platitudes, his eyes fixed on the deacon, whose face remained a mask of pious severity. The community, satisfied by the narrative of voluntary pious departure, began to settle back into their routine. This acceptance gave Tobias the cover he needed. He resumed Elias's daily routine: farm work, timber hauling, and, most critically, the solitary long walks into the woods, always heading toward the high ridge and the dense pines. He spent hours poring over Elias's journal, scrutinizing the bizarre, repetitive symbols. He began to copy them onto a clean sheet of parchment, trying to find a pattern, a sequence, or any connection to surveying markers or mining claims he remembered seeing. He realized the symbols were not just random, they changed slightly over time, becoming more complex, almost like a progression of a cipher or a record of locations. One afternoon, while working his father's old timber claim near the base of the ridge, Tobias struck an unexpected vein of luck. He found Caleb's discarded wooden toy soldier, one he had meticulously carved and painted, lying near a clump of overgrown ferns. Caleb was obsessive about his carvings and never left them behind. This time, however, the toy was a clue. The base of the soldier was carved with a single, small mark. The circle with 3 lines, one of the core symbols from the journal. Caleb, the timid boy with the bright mind, hadn't just accidentally lost his toy. He had deliberately marked his trail. Tobias looked up. The ferns grew over the remains of an old, crumbling stone foundation, the remnants of a long abandoned prospector's cabin, far older than any settlement in the current valley. He felt a shiver of cold realization. This cabin was the first marker, the beginning of a deliberate hidden path. Following the direction the toy soldier faced, Tobias pushed through the thicket. He spent 2 days meticulously searching the rugged terrain, uncovering a trail marked only by Caleb's small, deliberate efforts. A broken pottery shard positioned on a rock, a distinctive knot tied in a low-hanging branch, and always, somewhere nearby, a small, barely visible symbol carved into the bark of a tree, a direct match to Elias's journal. The trail led him deeper into the pine forest, past the point where he had found the locket, and ultimately to the mouth of a long-forgotten coal shaft. It wasn't a commercial mine, but a primitive prospect hole, a dark, narrow fissure driven horizontally into the side of the ridge, its entrance choked with overgrown briars. A wooden sign, now rotten and illegible, once warned people away. It was exactly the kind of dangerous, unstable place Elias had always preached against. Tobias cleared the entrance, pushing aside the crumbling supports. A cold, damp current of air rushed out, smelling of mineral dust and deep earth. It was a suffocating, terrifying darkness. He took a deep breath, lit his lantern, and ventured in. The shaft was narrow and unstable, the timber supports creaking ominously under the mountain's weight. The deeper he went, the clearer it became that this was not a simple abandoned hole. Someone had been maintaining it. The air was breathable, and the floor, while uneven, was clear of major debris. 100 feet in, the shaft widened slightly into a cramped work area. Here, Tobias found the chilling evidence of his father's terrifying obsession. Tacked to the damp rock wall were dozens of small charts, drawn in the same frantic hand as the journal's symbols. They were crude, detailed maps of the immediate area, marked with coordinates, magnetic bearings, and everywhere the same repetitive, cryptic symbols. It looked like a desperate private attempt to map something unseen, something below the surface. And in the center of the work area was a table fashioned from a split log, on which lay a small pile of coal and rock samples. Elias had been collecting and cataloging. He wasn't mapping a deposit. He was mapping something he had discovered in the rocks. Tobias picked up a handful of the samples. Most were unremarkable bits of anthracite coal and slate. But one piece was different, a shard of rock that was strangely heavy and unnaturally smooth. It was a deep charcoal black, but when he turned it in the lantern light, it revealed a subtle, unnerving pattern, a faint silver-gray striation that looked almost metallic, yet was clearly embedded in the rock. He felt a sudden, profound revulsion. This was what Elias had been documenting. This rock. What was it? Why was it so important that it drove a logical, God-fearing man to a secret, subterranean obsession? He noticed a small indentation in the center of the table. Reaching into his pocket, Tobias pulled out the torn journal. The size and shape of the indentation matched the missing page. Elias had been using the page to trace or rub something, perhaps to transfer a pattern or a specific data point. Then he saw it. Carved into the rock floor, directly beneath the work table, was a large version of the symbol, the circle with 3 lines, chiseled deep into the shale. It wasn't just a symbol for Elias. It was a mark of dedication, or perhaps ownership. Tobias's heart pounded. He was no longer looking for a runaway family. He was standing in the secret workshop of a man who had discovered something profound, something that had forced his entire family to flee or face a deadly consequence. The deacon's insistence on the madness of Elias was a carefully constructed defense against the very real physical discovery made here. Just as Tobias was about to leave, his senses sharpened by the fear, he heard a sound from the main shaft, a distinct, sharp scrape of boot leather on the stone floor, followed by the heavy, rhythmic breathing of a man approaching. He was not alone. In a blind panic, Tobias extinguished his lantern. The resulting darkness was absolute, crushing. The only sound was the frantic pounding of his own heart and the slow, deliberate approach of the unknown intruder. The air, already cold, seemed to drop another 10 degrees. He flattened himself against the cold, damp wall, his hand tightly gripping the knife on his belt. The man paused just at the entrance to the small work area. Tobias strained his eyes. He could just make out a figure, a large, bulky silhouette against the slightly less opaque darkness of the main tunnel. The figure was holding a lantern, but it was turned inward, shielding the light from the tunnel mouth. "I know you're in here, Tobias." A low, gravelly voice echoed off the damp stone. It was a voice he knew, Deacon Silas Finch. The deacon had been following him. He had not only known about Elias's obsession and this secret mine shaft, but he had been monitoring it, perhaps visiting it himself. The cover-up was far deeper than Tobias had imagined. "You should have stayed on the farm, Tobias," the deacon continued, his voice devoid of emotion. "You chose to believe the devil's whisper over the church's truth. Your father's disease must be dealt with quietly, for the stability of the valley." Tobias knew he couldn't face the deacon here, not in the narrow, suffocating confines of the mine, where his axe would be useless. He was trapped. But the fear of the deacon was suddenly replaced by a surge of pure adrenaline. He had to get the rock sample out. He had to show Amelia the truth of Elias's physical obsession. As Finch took one slow step closer, the light of his shielded lantern finally reflecting off the damp wall, Tobias hurled the heaviest, most common lump of coal he could find across the small workspace, crashing it against the opposite rock face. The deacon flinched, instinctively turning his shielded lantern toward the noise. In that fleeting second of distraction, Tobias scrambled deeper into the rear of the work area, crawling under the log table and disappearing into an even smaller, narrower crevice that the miners had used for storage. The cold, metallic rock sample was clutched tightly in his hand. He heard the deacon curse, a raw, unpious sound, followed by the heavy, frustrated thud of a boot against the floor. Tobias squeezed into the recess, pulling a few loose boards and rocks into the gap, praying they would conceal his presence. He had escaped the light, but he was trapped in the cold, unyielding darkness, with a secret that his community's most powerful man was willing to kill, to protect. He was now a fugitive in the very place he called home. Tobias spent an agonizing hour sealed within the shallow, cold crevice, listening to the frustrated movements of Deacon Finch in the main shaft. Finch paced, muttered scripture under his breath, a terrifying blend of faith and menace, and eventually gave up, the sound of his heavy boots receding slowly into the distance. Emerging from the crevice, Tobias was shaking, his clothes damp and smeared with black coal dust. He knew he could never return to the Alderson farm. The deacon knew his secret, and the lie of the voluntary departure was now a weapon aimed directly at him. He gathered his thoughts, his mind racing with the clarity that only acute danger brings. The deacon wasn't just covering up a scandal. He was protecting whatever Elias had found in the rock. The mine shaft was the key, and the rock was the evidence. Tobias secured the single, unnaturally smooth rock sample and the crude map charts, tucking them inside his shirt. He climbed out of the shaft and covered the entrance meticulously, trying to erase any sign of his visit. He spent the next day moving cautiously through the upper ridges, avoiding all trails and clearings. His immediate goal was to meet Amelia and Silas at a predetermined emergency rendezvous point, a cluster of old, abandoned beehive coke ovens near the Iron Creek settlement. It took him 3 days to cover the distance, traveling only at night. When he finally reached the desolate ovens, his sister Amelia and Silas were already waiting, their faces etched with anxiety. Amelia rushed to him, relief quickly replaced by alarm at his disheveled, wild appearance. "Tobias, what happened? We heard the talk, that you've gone missing too, that you left to follow your father's madness." "Finch, he was waiting for me," Tobias stated, his voice rough from disuse. He then laid out the evidence, the trail marked by Caleb, the secret mine shaft, the mapping charts, and the sudden, terrifying confrontation with the deacon. He then produced the heavy, black rock sample. "This is it, Amelia. This is what father was obsessing over. This is what the deacon is protecting." Silas took the rock, turning it over in his large, calloused hands. He examined the faint, silver-gray striations. "It's dense, heavier than any coal or slate I've seen. It's some kind of mineral composite, Tobias. But why would this drive a man to such secrecy and his family to flee?" Amelia was focused on the charts. "These symbols, I showed Eliza. She hasn't seen them, but she connected me with a retired surveyor in Hinton. He thinks they could be based on an old pre-Civil War land survey code, a private code used to mark areas of high mineral concentration before the state was even established." "High mineral concentration?" Tobias asked, a new alarming possibility forming. "Of what? Iron? Silver?" The surveyor mentioned that in this part of the mountains there were historical rumors of a particular vein of pitchblende, a uranium ore. Back then, they didn't know what it was, but they knew it was unnaturally heavy and could produce strange effects. He said prospectors would sometimes go mad or develop strange ailments after prolonged exposure. The word madness resonated, but this time, it was not a psychological malady. It was a physical poisoning. Elias wasn't mad, Amelia. He was sick, Tobias realized, the horror making his stomach clench. He was documenting the sickness, the changes in the rock, the exposure. He was trying to warn people, but the deacon, he must have seen the value in this mineral. If it's something rare, something valuable to the government or a railroad company, the church would move heaven and earth to control the land and the information. The tragedy suddenly snapped into focus. Elias Alderson hadn't just discovered a deposit. He had discovered a highly dangerous, yet potentially valuable mineral on land that the church likely controlled or coveted. His madness was the early stages of poisoning, and his pious departure was a cover-up to secure the land and the mineral rights without scrutiny. "The torn page," Amelia murmured, her eyes wide with cold certainty. That page contained the proof, the measurements, the location, or the symptoms. The deacon found the journal and ripped out the key to the mine and the truth. Silas, meanwhile, had carefully scraped a minute amount of dust from the rock sample and placed it on a small piece of linen. "I know a man at the rail yard, a metallurgist who checks the quality of our steel. He can analyze this discreetly. We need a confirmed identification." The immediate danger was Blair Valley, but the true enemy was the greed and power hidden within the church structure. "We need proof," Tobias insisted. "Proof that the deacon knew what this was, and that he forced them out, or worse. Elias wouldn't have left Caleb behind, not willingly. And Martha's note said, 'Safer now beneath the pines.' It suggests they were hiding, not traveling." The chilling thought of his family trapped somewhere near the mine, perhaps suffering the effects of the mineral, drove a spike of panic through him. Amelia's eyes hardened. "I'll go back to Eliza. She has contacts. We need to find out about land ownership records. If the church has recently tried to claim the land around that mine shaft, we have proof of their motive. Silas, you get that rock analyzed. Tobias, you need to return to the valley." "The deacon is looking for me," Tobias reminded her grimly. "Then you move like a ghost," Amelia said, placing her hand on his cheek. "Go back. But don't go near the farm. Go to the First Baptist Chapel itself, where the church keeps its records, where the deacon is most comfortable. You need to find the church minutes, the records of their private meetings. If they discussed Elias or the land, it will be there. We need to find evidence of a conspiracy, a premeditated plan to silence Elias." The idea was audacious, terrifying, and completely logical. The church had covered their tracks everywhere else. They might have overlooked the simple physical records of their own internal deliberations. "If I go to the chapel, I risk everything," Tobias said. The reality of breaking into the most sacred and secure building in the valley settling over him. "You have no choice," Silas said quietly, handing him a heavy iron crowbar he used for rail work. "They think your father went mad. They think you followed. Show them the real madness is their own greed. Find the minutes, Tobias. Find the proof." Tobias looked at the heavy rock sample and the crude map charts. His father wasn't a prophet or a lunatic. He was a victim of a corporate deadly secret that the church was determined to erase. He melted back into the shadows of the mountains, turning toward Blair Valley, no longer the simple farmer, but a man driven by the cold, clear need for justice. The true horror wasn't in the disappearance, but in the calculated evil of the people he had trusted most. The First Baptist Chapel was the most solid structure in Blair Valley, a squat, imposing building of dark stone and unforgiving lines. Its presence dominated the center of the settlement, a constant, tangible reminder of the church's authority. Breaking into it was not just a crime, it was an act of profound public defiance that would mark Tobias as an outcast forever. He approached the chapel after midnight, a moonless night adding to the deep, oppressive darkness. The air was cold, carrying the faint, distant sound of a mountain cat, a sound that only heightened his anxiety. He moved with the practiced stealth of a man who had spent his life hunting in the shadows, using the dense growth of the overgrown graveyard surrounding the chapel as cover. Tobias found the back window, a small recessed aperture near the choir loft, protected by a loose latch and a single rotting sill. He used the iron crowbar Silas had given him, working with agonizing slowness to pry the frame loose, the small grating sounds swallowed by the constant low wind that swept through the valley. He slipped inside. The air was heavy with the smell of old wood, dust, and something else, a faint, lingering scent of beeswax and old hymn books. The darkness was total, broken only by the sliver of grey light coming from the window he had entered. He had to find the church minutes. These were typically stored in the pastor's vestry, a small, secluded room behind the pulpit, where all official records, land deeds, and financial transactions were kept. Tobias moved silently through the main sanctuary, the worn floorboards groaning under his weight despite his care. The altar, a massive unadorned stone block, loomed ahead, and behind it, the heavy oak door of the vestry. The vestry door was secured by a heavy, old-fashioned bolt. Tobias used the crowbar as a lever, applying controlled, steady pressure, the iron groaning softly against the wood. With a low, sickening snap, the bolt gave way. He entered the vestry, pulling the door shut behind him. Here, the air was stale, close. He cautiously lit his lantern, shielding the flame inside the metal body so only a thin, directed beam of light escaped. The room was lined with shelves of Bibles, ledgers, and sermon notes. He systematically searched the shelves, his hands trembling with a mixture of fear and anticipation. He passed over finance books and birth records until he found a series of thick, dust-covered volumes labeled in neat script. First Baptist Chapel, Minutes of Session. He pulled down the volume covering 1877, 1878. Tobias flipped through the pages, his eyes scanning the densely written record of monthly church meetings. Most entries were mundane, discussions about roof repairs, choir funds, and community disputes. Then, halfway through the volume, he found the entry that made his blood run cold. Dated 3 weeks before the disappearance of the Alderson family, the entry was entitled, Discussion of Land Acquisition and Mineral Exploration Rights. The minutes detailed a closed-door meeting between Deacon Finch, the pastor, and 2 other senior members of the chapel. The discussion centered on a valuable mineral deposit discovered on land they believed was legally part of a 100-year-old church endowment. The entry went on to state that the discovery posed a threat to the community's stability due to a single, uncooperative landholder, a clear reference to Elias Alderson, whose farm bordered the ridge containing the Prospect mine. The text was guarded, but the intent was chillingly clear. The brethren agreed that the removal of the individual and his dependents, while regrettable, is necessary for the protection of the community's financial security and the integrity of the endowment. The individual's documented mental instability must be used to expedite the securement of the parcel and prevent any external interference. Deacon Finch volunteered to handle the arrangements discreetly. Tobias lowered the volume, his hands slick with sweat. The word removal wasn't a metaphor. Mental instability was the fabrication. The disappearance was not an escape. It was a kidnapping, orchestrated and sanctioned by the highest authority in the valley. The church had plotted the erasure of his family. His eyes fell on a heavy, locked iron chest tucked beneath a stack of old communion vestments. This chest, he knew, contained the actual land deeds and documents proving ownership. If the church was trying to claim the land, the original, legitimate deed must be there. The bolt was thick, but Tobias used the sharp, curved end of the crowbar, working it like a master lockpicker, until, with a heavy, metallic clunk, the chest sprang open. Inside, nestled beneath several rolled-up, brittle deeds, was a small, canvas-wrapped bundle. Tobias unwrapped it. It contained a single, small, hand-drawn map, an ancient yellowed surveyor's sketch of the ridge, and an object that made his heart stop, Caleb's compass. The small brass compass Caleb used for his mechanical tinkering, the one he never went anywhere without. But the compass was not lost. It had been stolen and kept by the deacon, presumably as a trophy or as a final, cruel piece of evidence. The presence of the compass in the vestry, along with the damning minutes, confirmed the deacon's direct involvement. Tobias carefully copied the relevant sections of the minutes into a small notebook and then turned his attention back to the map. It was crude, but familiar. It was a section of the Appalachian Ridge, and marked on it, in the same strange pre-Civil War code that Elias had been using, was an old, forgotten boundary line. Following the lines, Tobias realized that Elias had been entirely correct. The mineral deposit was not on church endowment land. It was located squarely on the Alderson family property, a small, valuable sliver of land that the church was now attempting to steal through fraud and violence. The deacon's plot was not about religion or community protection. It was about land, mineral wealth, and pure, calculated greed. As he was replacing the items in the chest, Tobias noticed a faint red stain near the bottom of the canvas wrap that held Caleb's compass. It was a thin, dark smudge, like old, dried paint. But it didn't smell like paint. It smelled faintly of copper and iron. It was blood. His control shattered. The possibility that the deacon had simply coerced his family into leaving was replaced by the terrifying certainty that he had harmed them. The blood on the canvas wrap was a signature of violence. Just as he was about to relock the chest, he heard a sound. Not the heavy boot of the deacon this time, but the sound of the main front doors of the chapel creaking open. Someone else had entered the chapel. Tobias grabbed the copied minutes and the iron crowbar. He extinguished his lantern, plunging the vestry back into total darkness, and retreated silently to the small space beneath the altar. The intruder moved into the sanctuary. Tobias pressed his ear against the floorboards, trying to identify the slow, measured footsteps. They were lighter than the deacon's, perhaps a woman's, but the pacing suggested a search, not a prayer. A match scratched, and a dim light flickered in the sanctuary. Tobias could hear the person moving toward the vestry door, the same door he had just forced open. The light stopped. A low, soft gasp echoed in the stillness. Then, the voice, whispering into the darkness. "Tobias, are you in here, son? I came back for you. I know you're here, Tobias. I saw your light." It was Martha Alderson, his mother. The shock was a physical blow, paralyzing him. She was alive. But her voice was strange, thin and brittle. It carried a haunting, unnatural calm that was far more unsettling than fear. She knew he was here. She knew the secret. But was she a prisoner, an accomplice, or a final devastating lure? Tobias remained frozen, pressed beneath the cold, dusty floorboards of the altar, his breath catching in his throat. The sound of his mother's voice was a devastating paradox, proof of life, yet soaked in an unnatural dread. She was standing just outside the vestry, the dim lantern light casting long, unstable shadows across the sanctuary. He had to know, was this a rescue or a trap? He carefully shifted the floorboard above his head, creating a minute gap, and peered out. Martha Alderson was thin, gaunt, her eyes wide and unnaturally bright in the dim light. She wore a simple, mud-stained dress and clutched a small, leather-bound prayer book to her chest. She looked like a woman who had suffered a profound, unendurable terror. "Mother," he whispered, a sound barely audible above the beating of his own heart. She turned her head slightly, directly toward his hiding spot. Her expression was not one of relief, but of chilling, profound sorrow. "Oh, my boy," she murmured, her voice breaking. "You shouldn't have come back. It was supposed to be over." She took a slow, deliberate step toward the altar. "They know you're here. They always know. This place, it sees everything, Tobias." She lifted the prayer book and placed it on the altar stone. "I saw your light from the road. I knew you would look in the records." "Who, Mother? Who knows? Where are Father and Caleb?" Tobias asked, his voice rough with urgency. Martha did not answer directly. She looked around the empty sanctuary as if terrified of the shadows themselves. "Elias. He was sick, Tobias. Not in the mind, but in the body. The rocks. They were poisoning him. He told Finch about the deposit, thinking the church would warn the others. But Finch, he saw money. He saw power." She confirmed the plot. The deacon had used Elias's initial symptoms, the tremors, the fatigue, the madness, to fabricate a reason for the removal. "The goal was the land. Finch didn't force us to leave," Martha whispered, leaning closer, her voice now a desperate plea for understanding. He gave us a choice. Sign the deed over to the church for a pittance, leave quietly, and go north to a distant town, or be declared insane, locked up, and have the land seized anyway. He threatened to take Caleb. He said he would let the madness take Elias in a cage. "So you left?" Tobias demanded, the betrayal sharp and painful. "You left your home, your son, and just vanished." "No," she said, tears finally tracing clean lines through the dirt on her face. "We signed the deed. Yes, but we knew Finch would never let us go. Elias planned the escape. We were supposed to meet the driver Finch hired, but Elias changed the route at the last minute. The note, beneath the pines. It wasn't a direction for you, Tobias. It was a code for the driver." She explained that Elias had hired a secondary man, an old, trusted colleague from his logging days, to intercept them. The plan was to use the pious departure lie as cover, but truly escape, taking the signed but not yet legally filed deed with them. We ran to the mineshaft. Elias wanted to retrieve his charts. He wanted proof of the mineral's danger before we fled. But when we arrived, she paused, trembling violently. Finch was already there. He was waiting. The moment of confrontation was agonizingly clear in her haunted eyes. Finch had likely been monitoring Elias's last desperate trips to the mine. Finch didn't come alone. He brought Thomas and Henry Weaver. The Weaver brothers were the Deacon's two silent, imposing farmhands, men known for their brutal strength and absolute loyalty to the church. "They took Elias," Martha continued, her voice barely a breath. "They demanded the original deed back. Elias refused. Caleb fought them. He threw his tools. He bit one of the men. I screamed. Finch was furious. He hit Elias hard." Tobias's breath hitched. Is father dead?" Martha closed her eyes, rocking slightly. "They dragged him deeper into the tunnel. They dragged Caleb too. Finch told me to sign a final new document, a confession stating Elias was mad and I was turning the children over to the church for spiritual guidance." The true horror of the cover-up was revealed. The deacon had captured them all. "I signed it. I signed the lie," Martha confessed, guilt overwhelming her face. "But I begged them to release Caleb. I told them I would vanish and keep the secret." Finch agreed. He made a terrible promise. What was the promise? He said if I never returned to the valley, they would simply hold Elias until he succumbed to the madness, and Caleb would be given to the church orphanage in Charleston, far away, under a new name. I was to become the mad wife who ran off into the woods. The deacon hadn't killed them. He had displaced and separated them, using Elias's sickness as the foundation for a legal, insidious capture. Martha had escaped the Weaver brothers in the chaos of the mine, carrying nothing but her prayer book and the knowledge of her sacrifice. She had been hiding in the hills, surviving on desperation, until she saw his light in the chapel. "They brought me back tonight to the valley," she whispered, looking toward the main door. "Finch is planning to give a testimony at the next session. He will announce that I have confessed to being the mad woman who facilitated the pious departure. He brought me back to sign the final notarized document in the morning." She stood up, her thin frame radiating a terrible resolve. "They are holding Elias and Caleb in the old supply cellar beneath the Weaver farm, a place where the brothers used to keep liquor barrels. It's soundproof, deep underground. Finch is going there now to secure the final official documents from the safe." "The safe?" "In the vestry wall," Martha said, pointing. "Behind the cross. He was there when you came in. He saw you enter. He was retrieving the original signed deed and the final confession documents. The blood on the canvas wrap must have been from the confrontation in the mine. And the deacon hadn't left the chapel. He had simply hidden. The moment Tobias had moved, the deacon had slipped out, probably to rally the Weaver brothers, leaving Martha to lure Tobias out. Tobias looked at his mother. Her eyes held no deceit, only a painful, terrible love. "We have to go now, Mother. We have to get to the Weaver farm." "No," she said, her voice shaking but firm. She retrieved a piece of crumpled paper from her prayer book and pressed it into his hand. "This is the original, unsigned, final deed, the one Finch wanted me to sign in the morning. I stole it from his coat pocket when he brought me in. It's a clean copy. The one I signed earlier is invalid without the pastor's witness. I need you to take this," she insisted, pushing him toward the back window. "Take this, and the minutes, and go to Amelia. Go to the city. Go to the authorities in Charleston. The moment Finch realizes I'm gone, he'll move them. You must get the proof out." Tobias grabbed her arm. "I'm not leaving you. We go together." A new sound cut through the silence, the heavy thud of a boot against wood. It was coming from the back door. The deacon was returning, and he was not alone. "It's too late," Martha said, pushing him toward the window. "I'll stall them. Go. Live, Tobias. Expose them. Save Caleb." He saw the raw, sacrificial love in her eyes, the love of a mother who had endured hell to ensure her son's escape. He knew this was the last time he would see her. He shoved the deeds and the minutes into his shirt, climbed back out the window, and crashed silently into the graveyard dirt. The last thing he heard before he sprinted into the surrounding darkness was the sound of the vestry door being kicked open, followed by his mother's single defiant scream. He was alone again, but he now carried the truth. A truth purchased by his family's sacrifice and sealed with his mother's impending capture. The journey to expose the church had just become a desperate race against time, with the lives of his father and brother hanging in the balance. Tobias ran from the chapel, driven by his mother's sacrifice. Exhausted, he reached Iron Creek and presented Amelia with the proof, the copied church minutes detailing the removal and the unsigned deed. Amelia confirmed the plot's true nature, corporate greed disguised as piety. But Tobias's eyes fixed on a detail in the minutes. 2 church elders sanctioned the plot. The Weaver brothers were muscle, not elders. He quickly realized the truth by recognizing a unique flourish on the deed meant for an elder's signature. The final conspirator was Amelia's husband, Silas Vance. "You, the second elder," Tobias roared, wielding the iron crowbar. Silas panicked, confessed to joining the plot for mineral profits, claiming he didn't know the family was imprisoned. He admitted to feeding Finch information, including Tobias's visit to the mine. Amelia watched, stunned, as Silas bolted into the fog, his betrayal shattering their trust. With their last ally exposed as an enemy, Tobias grabbed Amelia. They couldn't rely on anyone in the valley. They took the documents and rode hard for Hinton, determined to find the only institution that could challenge the church, the county marshal. The siblings pushed their horses for hours, finally reaching Hinton and rushing into the county marshal's office. Marshal Elijah Thorne was skeptical, examining the rock, the minutes, and the unsigned deed. "I need more than accusations and copies," he stated, warning of the church's power. Tobias and Amelia convinced Thorne to interview their cousin, Eliza Thorpe, who worked at the land registry. Eliza calmly confirmed the land suspicious and their movements, providing the external verification Thorne needed. As Thorne assembled his posse, the pastor of the First Baptist Chapel burst in, desperate and panicked. He threw Deacon Finch under the carriage, claiming Finch had gone mad, and acted alone to hold the Aldersons captive for purification. The pastor's hasty betrayal fractured the conspiracy, but his fear provided Thorne with the legal authorization to move. Thorne knew the truth was a systemic rot, but he used the pastor's lie to gather his men. Tobias and Amelia joined the posse, now racing back to the Weaver farm to save their family before Finch, cornered and unstable, could eliminate his loose ends. The posse reached the desolate Weaver farm at sunset. Marshal Thorne ordered Finch to surrender. A low, desperate sobbing from below the supply cellar confirmed Caleb was inside. Then, Deacon Finch emerged from the house, wild-eyed and wielding a double-barreled shotgun. Screaming about purifying the evil rock, Finch opened fire, sparking a brutal confrontation. In the chaos, Tobias seized the chance, lifting the cellar trap door and dropping into the cold darkness. He found Elias and Caleb chained to a pipe, Elias trembling from the mineral poisoning and starvation. As Tobias desperately attacked the thick chains with his crowbar, Finch climbed down, aiming the shotgun at Elias. Amelia screamed from the roof, distracting Finch just long enough for Marshal Thorne and his deputies to burst in, tackling the fanatical deacon. Tobias shattered the final lock. He pushed Caleb out to the deputies and helped his weak father to safety. Elias, seeing Finch defeated, managed a final coherent whisper. "The truth, Tobias. They wanted the rock." Finch was subdued and hauled away. Tobias led his father and brother into the fading sunlight, their terrifying ordeal finally over. Marshal Thorne used the evidence, the church minutes, the unsigned deed, and the toxic mineral analysis to expose the conspiracy. The deacon and pastor were arrested, their greed and terror ending the church's control. Martha Alderson was found, terrified but alive, locked in the vestry, and released. The land claim was restored to the Alderson family. The family left Blair Valley forever, using the proceeds from selling the regulated mining rights to find a new life and treat Elias. They left behind the isolation and the conspiracy, carrying only the scars of the true horror, human greed and betrayal. The mountains recorded the truth. The most disturbing Appalachian family tragedy the church tried to erase.